Charles Whitman sat at the mahogany dining table of the Laurel Heights Country Club, surrounded by an air of privilege that only old money could command. The clinking of glasses, the hum of laughter, and the faint melodies of a live quartet set the mood for the evening. It was his first time back at this monthly gathering in years, a group of men he once considered friends. But as he listened to their conversation, a heavy truth weighed on his heart. He no longer belonged among them. "Did you hear about the Sullivan boy?" laughed James Cartwright, his whiskey glass trembling in his hand. "Dropped out of law school to become a poet. Can you believe it? Waste of a perfectly good trust fund." The table erupted in chuckles, their voices brimming with derision. Charles, however, remained silent. His fingers traced the rim of his untouched wine glass as he braced himself for the bombshell he was about to drop. "Speaking of unconventional choices," Charles began, his deep, measured voice cutting through the noise, "I've made a decision I'd like to share with you all." All heads turned toward him. Some leaned back in their chairs, smirking, while others raised their brows with genuine curiosity. Charles had always been the odd one out, not because he lacked wealth or influence, but because his ambitions didn't always align with theirs. He wasn't interested in flaunting his status or preserving traditions for the sake of appearances. That night he was about to prove it once again. "I'm adopting," he said, his voice steady. The announcement hung in the air like a lead balloon. The laughter died down, replaced by murmurs and exchanged glances. Finally, Robert Hollis, a portly man with a booming laugh, broke the silence. "Adopting? Good Lord, Charles, what are you talking about?" Robert asked, his tone dripping with incredulity. "You're single. You could have your pick of any woman in this city and start a family the natural way." Charles smiled faintly, unbothered by the predictable reaction. He took a sip of water before continuing, his calm demeanor belying the storm of judgment he knew was coming. "Not just adopting. I'm adopting 7 girls," he said, placing the emphasis deliberately. 7. James spat out his drink, choking on laughter. "What are you, running a boarding house now?" The room burst into laughter again, louder this time. But Charles didn't flinch. He had prepared himself for this reaction, though it didn't make the sting of their mockery any less painful. "You're serious," said Matthew Hargrove, his tone no longer amused but puzzled. His graying temples and tailored suit gave him the aura of a wise elder, though his judgmental glare betrayed his biases. "Why on earth would you do that, Charles?" Charles leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Because they need me." He let the weight of those words settle before elaborating. "These girls lost their parents in a house fire last year. They've been shuffled through the foster care system ever since, split up across different homes. No one wants to keep them together, but I do." "But 7 of them," Robert exclaimed, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's madness. Do you have any idea what you're signing up for? 7 mouths to feed, 7 educations to pay for. And they're black, aren't they?" James interrupted, his tone laced with derision. The question, though rhetorical, dripped with a venom that Charles didn't miss. He met James's gaze head-on, his expression unyielding. "Yes, they are," Charles said firmly. "And that shouldn't matter." The table fell silent again, though this time the atmosphere was colder. No one dared to say what they were thinking outright, but the tension in the room spoke volumes. Charles had expected this. He knew these men who prided themselves on their progressive facades but balked at the thought of true equality. Matthew finally spoke, his voice low and cautionary. "Charles, I know you mean well, but do you really think this is wise? Bringing them into your world? You're setting yourself up for ridicule, and worse, so are they." "They've already been through worse," Charles countered, his tone hardening. "And if I have the means to give them a better life, then why shouldn't I?" "But it's not just about money," James interjected. "You're putting your reputation on the line. Do you really want to be the talk of every gala, every boardroom? People will wonder why you didn't just adopt 1 or 2. Why them?" Charles sat back, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Why not them, James? Is it so hard to believe that I see potential where others see inconvenience? Or is it just that they don't fit your image of what a family should look like?" James flushed, his smirk faltering. Charles's words hit closer to home than he'd admit. "Listen," Robert said, attempting to steer the conversation to safer ground. "It's your life, Charles. If you want to turn your home into some sort of charity project, that's your prerogative, but don't expect us to clean up the mess when it all falls apart." "I'm not asking for your help," Charles replied coolly. "I'm asking you to open your minds. These girls deserve a real chance, and if that makes me an outcast in this circle, so be it." With that, he rose from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The men watched in stunned silence as Charles gathered his coat and prepared to leave. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice laced with quiet conviction. "I have a family to prepare for." As he walked out of the room, the quartet resumed its playing, the lively tune feeling strangely hollow now. The laughter and whispers resumed as well, but Charles didn't look back. He had made his choice, and no amount of ridicule would make him question it. The drive home was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the faint sound of rain pattering against the windshield. Charles's thoughts swirled as he envisioned the weeks ahead. 7 girls, all with unique personalities, needs, and dreams. 7 lives that would now be intertwined with his. He thought of their faces when he first met them at the group home, nervous but hopeful, their eyes brimming with a cautious optimism that broke his heart. They had no reason to trust him yet, but he was determined to earn it. As his mansion loomed in the distance, its lights casting a warm glow in the night, Charles felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he'd ever known. This wasn't just about charity or making a statement. This was about love, about healing, about rewriting the narrative for 7 young souls who had been written off by society. When he stepped inside, he paused in the foyer, his eyes landing on the portrait of his late mother hanging above the staircase. She had always taught him that wealth was a tool, not a trophy, a means to uplift others, not just oneself. "I hope I'm making you proud," he murmured, his voice barely audible. In that moment, the laughter of his so-called friends was a distant memory, overshadowed by the promise of what lay ahead. Charles wasn't naive. He knew the road would be long and fraught with challenges. But he also knew that love was the greatest investment he could make. And he was all in. The sound of wheels crunching against the long gravel driveway filled the air as the van pulled up to Charles's sprawling estate. The driver glanced at Charles in the passenger seat, his brows furrowed with apprehension. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Mr. Whitman?" the driver asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Charles smiled faintly. "Ready or not, it's happening." He stepped out of the van and walked around to the back, where the social worker, Ms. Ramirez, was already opening the door for the girls. "Okay, ladies, we're here, Ms. Ramirez said, her tone bright and encouraging. But the 7 young girls who sat inside the van looked less excited and more anxious. They ranged in age from 6 to 15, their expressions a mixture of awe and weariness as they gazed at the grand estate before them. The youngest, Naomi, clung tightly to an old, tattered teddy bear as her wide eyes darted from the mansion to Charles. "Is this where we're going to live?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. Charles crouched to her level and smiled warmly. "Yes, Naomi, this is your home now." She blinked at him, as if trying to gauge whether he was serious, before nodding slowly. The older girls remained silent, their skepticism written plainly on their faces. Trust didn't come easily after everything they'd been through. "All right, let's get your things inside," Charles said, standing up and extending a hand to help the girls down from the van. One by one they emerged, each clutching their meager belongings, a stark reminder of the hardships they'd endured. The eldest, Ayana, stepped out last, her posture protective as she glanced around, her expression a mix of defiance and uncertainty. "This place looks too fancy," Ayana muttered under her breath, crossing her arms. Her voice carried a sharpness that belied her age. "What's the catch?" "There's no catch," Charles replied gently, meeting her gaze. "This is your home now, Ayana. No strings attached." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she didn't quite believe him, but she didn't press further. Instead, she turned her attention to her sisters, shepherding them toward the front door like a mother hen. The grand foyer of the mansion was warm and inviting, with polished wood floors and high ceilings. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. The girls stood huddled together, their small suitcases at their feet, their eyes scanning the space with a mix of awe and unease. "Come on," Charles said, motioning for them to follow him. "I'll show you your rooms." He led them up the sweeping staircase, his voice calm and steady as he pointed out various parts of the house along the way. Each girl had her own room, carefully decorated to reflect their ages and interests based on the profiles Ms. Ramirez had provided. For Naomi, there were shelves full of picture books and a bedspread covered in colorful stars. For Ayana, a desk and a bookshelf stood ready, waiting for the aspiring writer she'd mentioned in her interview. The girls' reactions varied. Naomi's face lit up as she ran to her bed, hugging her teddy bear tightly. "This is all mine?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "All yours," Charles replied, his chest tightening at the sheer joy on her face. The middle sisters, twins Amara and Kiara, exchanged skeptical glances as they explored their shared room. They touched the furniture cautiously, as if afraid it might disappear at any moment. "This is weird," Amara muttered. "It's nice," Kiara whispered back, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Ayana, on the other hand, stood in the doorway of her room, her arms crossed as she surveyed the space. She didn't step inside. Charles noticed her hesitation and approached carefully. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "It's just," she trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. "We've never had anything like this before. It doesn't feel real." Charles nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It'll take time," he said gently. "But it is real. You deserve this, Ayana. All of you do." She didn't respond but gave a slight nod before stepping into the room, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk as if testing its solidity. Later that evening, Charles gathered the girls in the dining room for their first meal together. The long table was set with plates of spaghetti and garlic bread, their favorite meal according to Ms. Ramirez. The girls ate quietly at first, their guarded glances flitting between each other and Charles. But slowly, the tension began to ease. Naomi giggled as Kiara slurped her noodles too loudly, and Amara cracked a joke about the size of the chandelier hanging above them. Charles watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. After dinner, as the girls got ready for bed, Charles lingered in the hallway outside their rooms. He heard Naomi's soft laughter as Ayana read her a bedtime story, and the faint sound of Kiara and Amara arguing over who got the top bunk. For the first time in years, the mansion felt alive, filled with the kind of warmth money couldn't buy. Charles leaned against the wall and exhaled deeply, the weight of the day lifting slightly. This was only the beginning. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The girls carried scars, both visible and invisible, and healing would take time. But for now, they were here together, and for Charles, that was enough. The years that followed were anything but smooth, yet they were transformative for both Charles and his 7 adopted daughters. In those early days, laughter often came paired with tears, and breakthroughs were met with moments of deep frustration. The family forged ahead together, their bonds strengthening as they faced challenges that none of them could have anticipated. Charles quickly learned that love, while powerful, wasn't always enough. His wealth and status opened doors for his daughters, but it couldn't shield them from the prejudice that followed them like an unwelcome shadow. The first test came just a few months after the girls had settled into their new home. Ayana, the eldest, had always been fiercely protective of her younger sisters, but her protectiveness often turned into defiance in the face of authority. This trait came to the forefront during a parent-teacher meeting at her high school. "I don't understand the concern," Charles said, seated across from Mrs. Harper, Ayana's English teacher. The small, cluttered office smelled faintly of coffee and whiteboard markers, and Charles's patience was wearing thin. "Ayana's grades are excellent. She's on the honor roll. What exactly is the issue here?" Mrs. Harper pursed her lips, her eyes darting to Ayana, who sat beside Charles with her arms crossed and her chin held high. "Mr. Whitman," she began carefully, "Ayana is very outspoken in class. While I admire her confidence, it can be disruptive." "Disruptive," how Charles pressed, his tone calm but firm. Ayana didn't wait for the teacher to respond. "Disruptive because I asked why we're only reading books by white authors," she said, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Disruptive because I pointed out that the curriculum doesn't include a single writer who looks like me or my sisters." Mrs. Harper's face turned a shade of pink that matched the folder she was clutching. "That's not what I—" "That's exactly what you meant," Ayana interrupted, her tone now icy. "You don't like it when someone questions the way things have always been." enough, Charles interjected gently but firmly. He turned to Ayanna, his voice softening. Let me handle this. Ayanna bit her lip but fell silent, her eyes still blazing with anger. Charles looked back at Mrs. Harper, his gaze steady. My daughter isn't being disruptive. She's being inquisitive. That's the mark of a good student, isn't it? Or does that only apply when the questions don't make you uncomfortable? Mrs. Harper opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly flustered. Charles didn't wait for her to recover. If Ayanna's behavior is an issue, I'd suggest you reflect on why that is. She's not just here to learn from you. You can learn from her as well. The meeting ended shortly after, and as they walked back to the car, Ayanna finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Thanks for sticking up for me, she said quietly. Charles smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. Always. But remember, there's a way to make your voice heard without making enemies. Let's work on that together. As Ayanna fought her battles in high school, her younger sisters faced struggles of their own. Naomi, the youngest, had always been the most cheerful of the seven, her infectious laughter brightening even the darkest days. But when she started first grade at the local private school, her light dimmed. I don't want to go back, Naomi said one morning, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched her backpack. Charles knelt in front of her, concern etched across his face. Why not, sweetheart? Did something happen? She hesitated, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The other kids said I don't belong there. They said I'm not really your daughter. Charles felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of anger and sorrow. He pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. Naomi, listen to me. You are my daughter. It doesn't matter what anyone else says. Do you understand? She nodded against his shoulder, her small body trembling. Charles spent the rest of that day meeting with the school principal, demanding stricter action against bullying and ensuring that Naomi would feel safe and valued. Despite these efforts, the girls continued to encounter microaggressions and outright racism from both peers and adults. Charles realized that he couldn't control how others treated them, but he could control how they responded. He began holding family discussions every week, encouraging the girls to share their experiences and teaching them how to navigate a world that wasn't always kind. Over time, each of the girls began to come into her own, finding ways to channel their pain into purpose. Amara and Kiara, the twins, discovered a passion for debate, often teaming up to take on their peers in competitions. Their sharp wit and unrelenting drive earned them accolades, but also whispers from those who resented seeing black girls excel. They only won because the judges felt bad for them, one competitor muttered after the twins secured their latest victory. Kiara overheard him and turned to face him directly. Or maybe we won because we're better than you, she said with a sweet but cutting smile. Amara laughed, patting her sister on the back as they walked away. Their confidence inspired their younger sisters, who began pursuing their own passions. Naomi took up painting, using bright colors to express her boundless imagination, while Leah, the shy and bookish one, joined the school newspaper, writing articles that highlighted stories of underrepresented students. Charles beamed with pride as he watched his daughters grow, their resilience and talent shining through despite the challenges they faced. But he also knew that their success came at a cost. For every triumph, there was a wound, a cruel comment, an unfair assumption that reminded them of the barriers they still had to overcome. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room for their weekly movie night, Ayanna pulled Charles aside. I've been thinking, she said, her voice hesitant. We should do more. More, Charles asked, raising an eyebrow. To help other kids like us, she explained. Kids who don't have someone like you to fight for them. Charles felt a lump form in his throat. He had always hoped that his daughters would grow into compassionate, driven women, but hearing Ayanna voice this desire filled him with a sense of fulfillment he couldn't describe. We'll find a way, he promised her. Together. That conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter for the family. They started volunteering at local shelters, organizing fundraisers, and speaking at community events. Ayanna even spearheaded a campaign at her school to diversify the curriculum, an effort that earned both praise and backlash. Through it all, Charles stood by his daughters, not as their savior, but as their unwavering support system. He knew they would face more battles in the years to come, but he also knew they were ready. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And that, Charles thought, was the greatest victory of all. It was a crisp autumn morning when the breakthrough came, though it arrived in a way no one expected. Charles sat in the audience of a grand auditorium, his heart swelling with pride as Ayanna stepped onto the stage to accept her award. She had won first place in the statewide essay contest, her piece entitled Unapologetically Black: My Journey to Embracing Identity, drawing accolades from judges across the state. As she approached the microphone, Charles noticed how composed she looked, a stark contrast to the nervous teenager she had been just a few years ago. Ayanna's voice rang clear and steady as she began to speak, recounting the moments of pain, triumph, and self-discovery that had shaped her. Growing up as one of 7 sisters, she began, a faint smile touching her lips. I learned quickly that love can be a powerful force against prejudice. My father showed me that even in a world full of people who try to define you by the color of your skin, you have the power to write your own story. Her words hung in the air, met with thunderous applause. For Charles, the moment was bittersweet. Ayanna had found her voice and was using it to inspire others, but it also reminded him of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The win catapulted Ayanna and, by extension, the entire family into the public eye. Articles were written about the Whitman household, focusing on Charles's adoption of the 7 girls and their accomplishments. At first, the attention was positive. Headlines praised Charles for his progressive parenting and celebrated the girls for their resilience and success. But the media attention also drew criticism. Comment sections on news websites were filled with vitriol, accusing Charles of using the girls as a social experiment or exploiting them for fame. The backlash was hurtful, but Charles knew it was part of the larger battle they were fighting against systemic racism. Ayanna, however, refused to let the negativity silence her. She took to social media, posting thoughtful responses to the criticism and using the platform to advocate for equity in education. Her courage inspired her sisters to do the same. Amara and Kiara began a video series discussing racial disparities in academic settings, while Leah published articles exposing discriminatory policies at schools across the state. It's like a domino effect, Charles remarked one evening as he watched the girls brainstorm their next project. You're inspiring people to stand up and fight for change. Naomi, now 10 and still the baby of the family, looked up from her sketchpad and smiled. We're just doing what you taught us, Dad. The turning point came during a charity gala hosted by the mayor's office. The event was meant to celebrate diversity, but Charles and his daughters quickly realized it was more about optics than substance. The guest list was dominated by wealthy elites, many of whom had little interest in meaningful change. As the Whitman family mingled, Charles overheard snippets of conversation that made his blood boil. I mean, good for him, one woman said, her champagne flute poised delicately in her hand. But 7? That's excessive. Another guest scoffed. I'm sure it's all for show. People like him love being praised as saviors. Charles turned away, trying to focus on his daughters who were handling the event with grace. Ayanna was deep in conversation with a journalist, while Kiara and Amara charmed a group of young professionals with their wit. Naomi clung to Charles's side, her wide eyes taking in the glitz and glamour. The evening took an unexpected turn when Ayanna was invited to speak. She had prepared a short speech about the importance of representation and inclusivity, but as she took the stage, Charles saw something shift in her demeanor. I had a speech prepared, Ayanna began, her voice steady, but I'm going to set it aside because there's something more important I need to say. The room fell silent. We're here tonight to celebrate diversity, she continued, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. But real diversity isn't about photo ops or charity galas. It's about changing the systems that hold people back. It's about making sure every child, regardless of their race, their background, or their zip code, has the same opportunities to succeed. Her words were met with a mixture of applause and murmurs. Charles watched as some attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. This isn't just my fight, Ayanna concluded. It's ours. And it's time we start acting like it. As she stepped down from the stage, the applause was thunderous. Charles could see the pride in her sisters' faces as they rushed to embrace her. For the first time, he felt that they were not just surviving in their world, they were reshaping it. The gala marked a new chapter for the Whitman family. Ayanna's speech went viral, sparking conversations nationwide. The family became a symbol of hope and resilience, but they never lost sight of their mission. Charles, ever the humble patriarch, took a step back to let his daughters lead the way. They launched scholarships, organized community events, and worked tirelessly to empower others. For Charles, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition or the success, it was watching his daughters thrive as leaders, each of them carving out a space in the world where they could shine. "We've come a long way," Ayanna said one evening as the family gathered in the living room. "But this is just the beginning." Charles nodded, his heart full. "And I'll be here for every step of it." The Whitman household was alive with energy on a warm spring evening, the kind of warmth that brought the scent of blooming jasmine into their open windows. Laughter echoed from the living room as the sisters teased Naomi about her latest painting, a vibrant yet abstract depiction of the family dog. Charles sat at the dining table, sipping tea and watching his daughters with a serene sense of pride. It was in the midst of this warmth that the past came knocking, quite literally. The doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the cheerful noise. Charles rose to answer, a small smile still on his face. But when he opened the door, the sight that greeted him erased it instantly. James Cartwright and Robert Hollis stood on his porch, their expensive suits and polished shoes a sharp contrast to the disheveled anxiety written across their faces. The men who had once mocked him so relentlessly now looked desperate, their smugness replaced by thinly veiled humility. Charles James began, his voice awkwardly strained. "We need to talk." Charles hesitated for a moment, taking in the sight of his former friends before stepping aside. "Come in," he said simply, his tone devoid of warmth. The men entered, their eyes darting around the house as though they were seeing it for the first time. It was no longer just a wealthy man's mansion, it was a home, filled with photos of the girls' milestones, their awards, and candid shots of a family bound by love. The sight seemed to unsettle them. Charles led them to the sitting room, where he gestured for them to take a seat. He remained standing, his arms crossed as he leaned against the doorway. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. James cleared his throat, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "We're in a bit of a bind," he admitted. "A financial one." Robert, less composed, blurted out, "The market's tanked, Charles. Our investments. Well, let's just say we could use some help." Charles raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Help? From me?" James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We know we haven't exactly been supportive in the past," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But we've heard about the success of your daughter's ventures, the scholarships, the community outreach programs. It's impressive, really." Robert nodded, his eagerness almost pitiful. "We thought maybe there might be a way for us to partner on some projects, mutually beneficial." Charles let out a soft chuckle, though it carried no humor. "Let me get this straight. The same men who laughed at me for adopting my daughters, who questioned their worth, are now asking for their help." James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Robert looked away, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Do you even hear yourselves?" Charles continued, his voice rising slightly. "You mocked me for bringing those girls into my home. You ridiculed them without knowing anything about their strength, their brilliance. And now when your empire is crumbling, you want to ride on the coattails of their success." The room fell silent, the weight of Charles's words pressing down like a heavy fog. James finally spoke, his tone low and almost pleading. "We were wrong, Charles. About you, about them. We see that now." Charles stared at them for a long moment, his expression softening just slightly. "It's not me you need to apologize to," he said. "Wait here." He left the room and returned a few moments later with Ayanna, Amara, and Kiara. The three women entered with a quiet confidence, their presence commanding the space. James and Robert shifted in their seats, clearly unnerved. "What's going on?" Dad, Ayanna asked, her sharp eyes flicking to the two men. "These gentlemen have a request," Charles said, his voice carefully neutral. "They'd like your help with their financial troubles." Amara let out a short laugh, while Kiara crossed her arms, her eyebrow raised in disbelief. Ayanna, ever the composed leader, stepped forward. "Let me get this straight," she said, her tone laced with controlled indignation. "You're asking for help from the same family you dismissed as a charity case? From the daughters you didn't think were worthy of being part of this world?" James tried to meet her gaze but faltered under its intensity. We made mistakes, he admitted quietly, and we're asking for a chance to make things right. Ayanna exchanged a glance with her sisters, their silent communication speaking volumes. Finally, she turned back to the men. We don't owe you anything, she said firmly. And we certainly don't need your approval or your partnerships. But if you're serious about making amends, start by supporting the causes you once ignored. Donate to organizations fighting for equality. Use your influence to advocate for systemic change. Prove that your words mean something. James and Robert nodded, their faces a mixture of shame and relief. We'll do that, James said. Thank you. Ayanna didn't respond, but the steel in her eyes made it clear that their actions would speak louder than their promises. As the men left, Charles turned to his daughters, pride evident in his expression. You handled that better than I ever could have. Ayanna shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. You taught us well. For Charles, the moment was more than just vindication, it was a testament to the strength and integrity of his family. They had faced the world's cruelty and emerged not just unbroken, but unshakable. And in that, Charles saw the greatest victory of all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm amber hues across the estate, the Whitman family gathered on the back patio for a rare evening together. Naomi was sprawled on the grass, painting the sunset in bold strokes, while Kiara and Amara debated the latest topic they'd covered in their debate team practices. Leah sat cross-legged on a lounger, editing an article for her college newspaper. Ayanna, as usual, was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed a new initiative with a community leader. Charles leaned back in his chair, sipping tea and taking it all in. This was the family he had envisioned, though the journey to this point had been fraught with challenges and sacrifices. The road had been long, but they had arrived together, stronger than ever. It was only a week after James Cartwright and Robert Hollis's visit that the family found themselves at the center of yet another pivotal moment. Ayanna had been invited to speak at a national summit on educational reform, her campaign to diversify curriculums gaining traction across the country. The event, held in Washington, D.C., was expected to draw thousands of attendees, including lawmakers, activists, and educators. The family decided to make the trip together, not just to support Ayanna, but to represent the unified front they had become. Charles arranged for a modest yet comfortable stay at a local hotel, insisting that this trip was about their mission, not luxury. On the day of the summit, the energy in the conference hall was electric. Attendees buzzed with excitement, their conversations creating a symphony of hope and determination. Ayanna stood backstage, clutching her note cards, her usually steady hands trembling slightly. You're going to be amazing, Charles said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Just speak from the heart, like you always do. She nodded, taking a deep breath. This isn't just about me, she said softly. It's about us, all of us. Charles smiled. Exactly. Now go show them what you're made of. When Ayanna stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She stood at the podium, scanning the sea of faces before her. With a deep breath, she began. My name is Ayanna Whitman, and I am the proud daughter of a family built on love, resilience, and hope. She started, her voice steady and strong. But I am also the product of a system that wasn't designed for people like me to succeed. Her words were raw and poignant, recounting her experiences of navigating a world that often saw her as less than. She spoke of the teachers who doubted her, the peers who dismissed her, and the institutions that tried to box her in. But she also spoke of the father who fought for her, the sisters who inspired her, and the community that empowered her to rise above it all. We are here today not just to talk about reform, she said, her voice rising with conviction. We are here to demand it, to create a world where every child, regardless of their race or background, can see themselves reflected in their education, their leadership, and their future. The room erupted into applause as Ayanna stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding with both nerves and exhilaration. She caught Charles's eye in the audience, and he gave her a subtle nod, his pride immeasurable. After the summit, the Whitmans were approached by countless attendees, each eager to express their admiration or discuss potential collaborations. Among them was someone Charles didn't expect to see: James Cartwright. James waited awkwardly on the edge of the room as the family spoke with others, his usual bravado replaced with a tentative humility. Finally, as the crowd thinned, he stepped forward. "Ayanna," he began, his voice hesitant. That was inspiring. Truly. She regarded him with a measured gaze, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply. James cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "I owe you and your family an apology," he said, looking between Ayanna and Charles. "I see now how wrong I was, how blind I was. Your words tonight, they opened my eyes." Charles stepped forward, his expression softening. "It's never too late to change, James," he said. "But words are just the beginning. What matters is what you do next." James nodded, his gaze steady. "I intend to prove myself," he said. "Not just to you, but to everyone I've let down. If there's anything I can do to support your efforts, please let me know." Ayanna studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Support isn't about writing checks or making speeches," she said. "It's about using your privilege and influence to dismantle the systems that uphold inequality. Are you ready to do that?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I am." It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a start. Back at home, the Whitmans held a small celebration to mark Ayanna's success. The house was filled with laughter and the smell of Charles's homemade lasagna, a family favorite. As the evening wore on, they gathered in the living room, reminiscing about their journey. "Remember when Naomi tried to redecorate her room with crayons?" Amara teased, earning a playful shove from her younger sister. "Or when Ayanna tried to boycott the school cafeteria over their lack of vegan options?" Kiara added with a grin. Ayanna rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "Hey, I was ahead of my time." Charles watched them with a full heart, their banter a testament to the unbreakable bond they had forged. He raised his glass, the room quieting as the family turned to him. "I just want to say how proud I am of all of you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You've faced so much, but you've never let it define you. You've taken every challenge and turned it into an opportunity to grow, to inspire, and to lead." He paused, his gaze sweeping over each of them. "You are my greatest accomplishment, and I know that this is only the beginning of the incredible things you'll achieve." The sisters cheered, clinking glasses and exchanging hugs. In that moment, the past seemed distant, its pain overshadowed by the joy and promise of the future. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Charles stood in the doorway of the study, gazing at the family portrait that hung on the wall. The photo, taken just a year after the adoption, showed 7 bright-eyed girls and a man who had no idea what he was in for, but who wouldn't have had it any other way. "Mom," he whispered, his voice soft, "I hope I've made you proud." He knew that their story wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was about creating a legacy of love, one that would ripple outward and touch countless lives. And as he turned off the lights and made his way to bed, he knew, deep in his heart, that they had done just that.